It's undeniable that retro game prices have skyrocketed in the past 5 to 10 years. Many YouTubers have made videos voicing their frustrations and talking about how much more expensive games are now. How back then you could pick up a ton of games for unbelievably low prices. Some people will even go as far as telling you that you shouldn't get into retro gaming because of the insane prices. And yeah, I won't lie to you, the prices of games now are not the same as they used to be. I mean, there's a lot of games that I want, but they're just too expensive. You know, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Shantae. But is it really as simple as retro games are expensive, don't buy them? Like, does this apply to every single retro game that I would possibly want to get? Also, what exactly do people mean by expensive? Like, can I sell my copy of Super Mario World for $100 now? I mean, that's a good game. Also, does every retro console have expensive games? Or is it just some consoles? And what if I'm not a collector? What if I just want to play these games? Okay, these are some very important questions, and let's try to answer all of them. But first I want to talk a little bit about how this even happened. Like, what caused the prices to get so bad where people don't even want to get into the hobby anymore? The primary way for a good to increase in price will be an increase in demand. And demand for retro games is definitely at an all-time high. Most people attribute the higher demand to the COVID-19 pandemic, which saw most of us sitting at home with a lot of free time on our hands. We started to rekindle our interest in old hobbies that we had previously left behind. Many gamers were buying the video games they grew up playing. This of course caused prices to swell, but it's probably not the only reason prices went up, as some people also blame Wada Games, a video game trading company, for their manipulation of the graded retro game market. YouTuber Carl Jobs made a great video on this, which I recommend you watch to get a better understanding of the situation. But basically, Wada was trying to create an artificial price bubble to inflate the prices of video games. This bubble may have caused some people to think that retro games were becoming a valuable collectible, and that they better get in on the market now before games get even more expensive. It may also be a snowball effect where people who are into retro gaming get even more people into retro gaming. Like YouTubers like me making videos about retro games, and people see these videos and think, hey, I want to play retro games too. So then more people buy games, and that causes the prices to rise even higher. Regardless, it's clear that many factors are responsible for the increase in prices, and it's hard to pinpoint any one thing as the sole cause. In order to have a meaningful conversation about retro game prices, we need a way to know exactly what games are worth. PriceCharting keeps track of all retro game sales that have taken place on eBay. They also do other collectibles like trading cards, comics, and coins, but that's not really relevant to this video. Now, I've seen people criticize PriceCharting in this regard, pretty much saying that it doesn't reflect the actual price of retro games because it only documents eBay sales. And not every retro game is purchased on eBay, as some are bought on other websites or through local marketplaces. And I have to say that this is a very good point and completely true. And I will say this, just because PriceCharting has a game listed at $50 doesn't mean you have to pay $50 for it. You might end up finding it for $30. So yeah, you do need to be careful with PriceCharting because it may lead you to believe that games are more expensive than they actually are. Regardless, I still think PriceCharting is a very valuable resource, as most people that are selling games, whether on Facebook Marketplace, Mercari, or even just selling them to a friend, are gonna look at PriceCharting before making a sale. I mean, are you just gonna pick up a random game from your collection and sell it for $20? No, right? The game could be worth $100 for all you know. Or if you're on the other side of the coin and looking to buy a game, you're definitely gonna wanna look at PriceCharting to make sure you don't get ripped off. So while PriceCharting isn't the comprehensive resource it appears to be, it's still a damn useful one. To start off, let's quickly go over regions, as they're very relevant to game prices. So if you don't know, Nintendo makes different versions of games for different regions of the world. Usually the biggest difference between a game from Japan and a game from America will be the language, but you can also expect differences in box art and packaging. PriceCharting separates games by region, so it's important to know the distinction here. If we look up the game Pokemon Emerald as an example, you'll notice that there are 3 different versions of it listed here. One of them just says Game Boy Advance, another one says JP Game Boy Advance, and the last one says PAL Game Boy Advance. The 3 different versions here correspond to different regions that the game was released in. The distinction is important because the price of any given game will vary by region. The listing that only reads Game Boy Advance is referring to the North American version of the game. The listing that reads JP Game Boy Advance is referring to the Japanese version of the game. And the listing that reads PAL Game Boy Advance is referring to the European version of the game. You'll also notice that the prices of each game version are wildly different, with the North American one being the most expensive. This won't be the case for every game, however, as some Japanese games are more expensive than their North American counterparts. But it honestly does feel like North American games are more expensive than Japanese ones. Throughout this video, I'll be including a lot of specific prices of games, and I want you to keep in mind that these are all North American prices, as that's the region where I live. Upon actually clicking on a version of the game, you'll see that there are several different prices for that one version. First, you have your loose price, which is the price of just the game cartridge or disc. Then you have your complete price, which may also be referred to as CIB or complete in box, and is the price of the game, instruction manuals, box, and anything else that came with the game. And finally, for our purposes, we have the new price, which is the price of the game as you would have bought it brand new at the store. These are also referred to as sealed games. Loose prices are the cheapest here, and they're really all you need to be able to play retro games. I personally only buy complete in box games if those games are disc-based, or also Nintendo DS games just because I like to have those in the box. And thankfully you'll find that disc-based games are usually the cheapest, so you won't have to pay a lot more to get them with the manual and the box. Now that we have a way of knowing how much our games are worth, let's explore which games are the most expensive and which games are the cheapest. I'll be ranking retro games into several categories here, starting with the most expensive and working my way down to the least expensive. Now I will say that the grouping of these categories is completely arbitrary and made up by me, but I did try to group games by pricing and then gave each of these groupings an appropriate title. For any given console, the most expensive games will always be those games that are in limited supply, games for which there aren't many copies around for you to play anymore. You'll find that this is also the case with any collectible and not just games. A good example here is Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut for the Nintendo 64, which currently goes for around $1,000. Why so much, you may be asking? Well, only 20,000 copies of this game were manufactured in North America and sent to Blockbuster stores. Another even rarer example is that of the Nintendo World Championship cartridges, of which there are only 116 in existence, 90 of these being gray and 26 being gold. The gray ones were given to the finalists of the Nintendo Championship, while the gold ones were given away in a Nintendo Power contest. Are you ready to hear how much these cartridges go for? Well, the gold one is currently worth $18,000, while the gray one goes for $22,000. And this isn't surprising with how few of them are out there in the wild. Next up, we have games that are critically acclaimed, but didn't sell really well. Good examples of this are the SNES games Chrono Trigger and Earthbound, which go for $200 and $308 respectively. The sales of these two games combined aren't even half that of Super Mario World, another game released for the SNES. This is honestly a tragedy, as both of these games are amazing, but good luck finding an original copy without paying an arm and a leg. An even more egregious example of this is that of Shantae on the Game Boy Color. This game is currently going for $652 and is the most expensive Game Boy game today. We don't know exactly how many copies of it were sold, but people estimate it to be around 20 to 25,000, which explains the insane price point. After this, we get into the category of Pokemon, Zelda, and Metroid games. Now these games seem to be expensive just to be expensive, as the Pokemon games sold really well. Take Pokemon Emerald as an example. It sold over 7 million copies, yet is still going for $158 today. I find this to be really infuriating, as there's no reason this game should be priced that high. Another great RPG on this same console, Golden Sun, sold only 1.65 million copies, yet is selling for only $39. You also have your 2D Zelda games like Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, which go for around $55 a piece. The Game Boy Advance Metroid games, Zero Mission and Fusion, are also some of my favorites, but are quite pricey at $69 and $42 respectively. Then we have good games that sold decently well, and also hidden gems. These games are around the same price point as the Pokemon, Zelda, and Metroid games. The Game Boy Advance has a ton of these, like the aforementioned Golden Sun, and also Fire Emblem. Aladdin, also for the Game Boy Advance, is going for the ridiculous price of $50. And I say ridiculous because on the Genesis, this game is only going for $8. On the SNES, you have a game like Contra 3 that goes for $46. After this, we get into the games that sold exceptionally well. I'm talking the best sellers on a console. And this is honestly where I think you'll find some of the greatest games that are still affordable. Take Super Mario World on the SNES for example. This game only sells for $19. Or maybe you want the classic Super Mario Bros. On the NES? Well, contrary to what the idiots trying to sell this game for thousands would have you believe, this game is only worth $16.39. Or if you're a handheld gamer, then you'll find that all the Super Mario Advance games are really affordable. Other examples of this are Sonic on the Genesis, any of the GTA games on the PS2, and also Wii Sports. Lastly, we get into the category of forgettable games, the cheapest games out of the bunch, games that people don't really seem to care about anymore. Here you'll find all the sports games, movie games, cartoon games, shovelware, and just any other random crap. All of these games are generally priced under $10, and if you had a retro console growing up, then you for sure had a ton of these. And I'm not saying that these games are necessarily bad, as one of my favorite games here is Lilo and Stitch on the GBA, but I'm just saying that these games don't get as much attention, and thus their price is relatively low. If you want to see the multitude of these games for any console, just go on PriceCharting, go to video games, select the console, sort it by price, low to high, then scroll down a bit and you'll be able to see all the very cheap games on a console. Also, these games are notoriously hard to sell, so resellers tend to stay away. You'll regularly find people selling these games in bulk, and even then they don't sell very often. With games out of the way, we do need to ask, what consoles have the most expensive games? If you split up games into their corresponding console, you'll notice that some consoles have games that are much more expensive than others. PriceCharting has a very interesting stat that tells you the average price of every game on a given console. It also tells you how much these prices have changed throughout the past 2 decades. And it's split up by region, so if you select an American console, then you'll only get prices for that region. Big disclaimer here though, keep in mind that every single game on the console you select will be included in the average. So if you select the NES for example, you'll get expensive stuff like the Nintendo World Championship cartridge, but also really cheap stuff like ice hockey. So given that, it might not be an accurate representation of what you, the viewer, are going to pay for games, but it's still a very interesting statistic to look at. I went ahead and jotted down the averages of a good number of consoles that people like to play. I didn't include every retro console, however, just the more popular ones. You'll see that the NES is actually the most expensive one here, as games average $46.17 on it, while the original Xbox is at the bottom with an average game price of $9.75. I'm not really surprised by this, as the NES was the original Nintendo home console in North America, and people seem to still be really into it, while the original Xbox on the other hand doesn't drum up much support, given that a lot of its games can still be purchased on newer Xbox consoles. I've seen a lot of original Halo games at thrift stores and nobody really seems to care about them. Now I do want to say this though, just because the NES is at the top of the list and according to these statistics has the most expensive games, doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of really good NES games that are affordable. So don't let these statistics discourage you. Go out there and buy games for whatever console you're interested in. And yes, I know that these averages don't say much about the specific games that you want to play, so let's look at some specific examples of games. Keep in mind that depending on the type of games you want to play, you're either going to be very lucky or very unlucky. Now maybe you're an SNES guy that loves platformers, and in that case you'll be in luck as there's a lot of really good platformers on here that aren't too expensive. Now someone who isn't very lucky is the RPG guy on the SNES, as all of these amazing games are so expensive. I mean, I'm crying just looking at these prices. Now if you're the Metroidvania guy, you don't have it as bad as the RPG guy, but these prices are still messed up, man. Or maybe you're yelling at me and saying, hey, I like puzzle games, dude. Oh, you do? Well, you're in luck, my friend, as all of these NES puzzle games are pretty affordable. And that goes for puzzle games on any console. They're not too expensive. There are some outliers, of course. I mean, can anyone tell me why Kix is $52 on the NES, when on the Game Boy it's not even worth selling? Also, what if you're a big 2D Zelda guy? Yeah, I'm not surprised here. Zelda games are pretty awesome, and the same goes for Pokemon games. I was even generous enough to include the cheapest Pokemon game of each generation, and even then they're still somehow expensive. But hey, Pokemon Pearl is only $30. I wonder why. Also, what if you hate Nintendo and you want to play Genesis? Well, in that case, it just depends what you want to play, as Genesis is a mixed bag, with great games that are expensive and great games that are cheap. But I will say that you can usually get better deals on these games on Facebook Marketplace, as people don't seem to value them as much as Nintendo games. Okay, but what if you don't want to play 16 or 8-bit games? What if you want to play the PS2? Well, you were very spoiled, my friend, as literally every game on this console is affordable. Except FIFA 14, that's $100. But other than that, you're good. Wait, why is FIFA 14 $100? Okay, so maybe not all games on the PS2 are cheap. The Silent Hill series will run you a pretty penny. But still, the vast majority of good PS2 games are definitely affordable. GTA, Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, God of War, you name it. Now I want to give you guys some recommendations for some of the more popular consoles. These are games that I personally like and that are affordable. The only rule here is that I'm going to keep it to games under $35. Starting with the NES, we have the original Zelda game, which goes for around $32. This game is very different from every other Zelda and is not just a crappier version of the newer games. It has its own thing and does it very well. Then we have the Super Mario Bros. Trilogy, and these are just must-haves for anyone that has an NES. After that, we get into Contra for $34, and this is a great two-player experience that is a very challenging game if you're used to modern games now. Metroid is here, and although the game isn't as refined as the newer entries, it's still amazing to be playing a Metroid game on the NES. Castlevania is $29, and this game just has an amazing soundtrack. Tetris is $10, and the only bad thing I have to say about this game is that it doesn't have the iconic Tetris theme. There's also Dr. Mario for $7, and if you haven't played Dr. Mario, then you're in luck because the original is honestly the best way to experience the game. Moving on to the SNES, let's start with Link to the Past, which is here for $34, and is a contender for being the best game of all time. I don't think it's where you should start with the Zelda series, but it's a game you don't want to miss. We also have the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, and all these games are also very cheap. The movement and graphics here are superb. Then we get into Super Mario All-Stars for $22. Now this game is a collection of remakes of all the Super Mario Bros. Games on the NES. You get Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, and 3, and also the Lost Levels, which is what Japan's Super Mario Bros. 2 was. Now I do want to say that this is such a good deal considering how many games you get here. Mega Man X is $30, and this one is one of the purest Mega Man experiences you can get. Lastly, the best-selling Super Mario World is only $19. This game is a masterpiece, and I'd be surprised if you told me you haven't played it. Then we get into Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Link's Awakening is $32, and honestly has to be the best game on the Game Boy. It's what made the Zelda series finally click for me, and the point at which I became a fan. Tetris here is $15, and this game actually supplies you with the iconic music we all know and love. Super Mario Land 2 is here for $20, and I will say that the entire Super Mario Land series on the Game Boy is very cheap, but this one is my favorite. If you haven't played this game, you'll find it to be very different from any of the other Super Mario games. Okay, here's where my bias comes in. But Battletoads here is only $21 and is probably the best beat 'em up on the Game Boy. I say this because the movement is extremely refined and doesn't feel slow like other beat 'em ups. Also, each level is unique and the game never gets repetitive. Lastly, Wario Land 3 coming in at $23. This game is very different from Mario as it has some really fun puzzles that will force you to think outside the box. Then we get into my favorite handheld, the Game Boy Advance. You can look at the entire Mario Advance series here, which offers remakes of some great NES and SNES games. Remakes of Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, and Super Mario Bros. 3. In terms of Super Mario Bros. 3, and don't get mad at me for this, but I think this may just be the definitive way to experience that game. Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga is $24, and let me tell you this right now, if you like RPGs and you want a game to play on the GBA, get this one right now. I don't even want to say anything about it, just go play it. It's my favorite Game Boy Advance game. Okay, here's one from my childhood, Lilo and Stitch, which is only $8. This is a side-scrolling shooter in which Stitch just becomes a total badass. Next, a cheap Metroidvania. Yep, these do exist actually. Castlevania Circle of the Moon for $27. This game totally blew me away. Like, I had no idea how good this game could get, and it honestly just keeps getting better as you play through it. Okay, so I know I didn't cover every console, and that's because I honestly haven't played every retro console, so I'm sorry about that. But if you go on PriceCharting and you pick a console, and you sort the games by the most popular, you'll really get to see what that console has to offer, so I recommend you give that a try for any console I didn't cover. Okay, so we've definitely proven with concrete examples that not all retro games are expensive. There are many great games that are affordable, but this leads me to another question. How do we go about buying these games? This is quite a big sector in the discussion of retro game prices, as there are some important things you need to know. First of all, it's pretty easy to find good prices for games as long as you know what you're doing. An important concept that I really want to grill into you guys, and some of you are probably aware of this already, is that you need to understand the difference between what games are listed for and what they're actually selling for. If you look up Pokemon Ruby on eBay and you see it listed for $100, that doesn't mean that it's actually selling for $100 or that it's even worth that much. A lot of websites do, however, let you look at listings that have already sold, and this can give you a much better idea of what games are selling for. I think Facebook Marketplace is a big culprit of blurring the lines between what games are listed for and what they're actually worth. If you go on it right now, the listings you'll immediately see are the things that haven't sold, the items that sellers are still holding on to. If you type in 3DS for example, you'll see some pretty crazy prices on these things, but these are the consoles that aren't selling. The consoles that are listed way too high and are just sitting there, waiting for some poor soul to purchase them. And if you're someone selling a 3DS and you see these prices, you might think that the console is actually worth that much. Fortunately, a lot of sellers do understand the distinction between what a game is listed for and what it's actually worth. They list their stuff appropriately and it actually gets sold. You won't usually see these items when you're logging on, but if you check it every now and then, you'll definitely find something for a good price. Now I want to bring up price charting here again and tell you that it does show the prices of what games are selling for, but like I stated earlier, it only shows eBay prices. I want to make something very clear here. Just because price charting tells you a game is worth a certain amount, doesn't mean you can't find it for cheaper. And here's where Facebook Marketplace and OfferUp come back up again, as you will consistently be able to snag games on these platforms for cheaper than price charting would have you believe. Your average person may list their games here for high prices, thinking they've struck gold, but they'll soon realize that nobody is going to pay that much for a game and start lowering their prices. Now when messaging people on here, you should always haggle to get the price lower. Obviously don't be that guy that offers them 50% of what they're asking, but also don't be afraid to get in there and negotiate. You also need to be careful with what I like to call crackhead sellers. You may know them by their other name, scalpers. These people list their game at unbelievably high prices and because they've sold a couple games at those prices, that gives them the motivation to just keep doing it. One thing that crackhead sellers like to do is put their games in a little stand like this. Like, yeah, look at me, I put the game in a stand, so now it's worth $50 more. Don't buy from these people. They're the reason games are so expensive, and purchasing from them contributes even more to the issue. Flea markets and yard sales also exist, and you will find low prices here, but keep this in mind. If you're going to yard sales, don't give up so easily. Just because this Saturday you didn't find much, doesn't mean you won't strike gold next Saturday. Another thing you can do is ask your friends if they have any retro games. This is the best method here, as they'll probably give you the stuff for free, or they might be willing to trade. And this is where I struck gold, as it's how I got my Wii U and 3DS. In terms of going on Facebook Marketplace, two of the best things I found were this blue 2DS for $40 and this copy of Pokemon Silver for $20. I also found Wario Land 3 for $15, which isn't the craziest deal, but it's still not bad. To add to this, just the other day when I was driving home, I saw this CRT television on someone's yard with a sign next to it that said free. I was very happy about this because crackhead sellers love listing crappy CRTs for like $100. Now for those of you that would rather just buy games online, here's some things you should know. For starters, expect to pay more. Mercari sellers usually list items at their price charting price, but when you factor in shipping and taxes, it always ends up being more. A lot of people cite eBay as well, and it's a good place to go if you're willing to bid on items. You do need to be careful though, as crackhead sellers love to sell on eBay and Mercari. The biggest thing you'll see on both of these sites is an abundance of fake games. And yes, I know there's this whole discussion about whether you should buy fake games or not, and that's honestly up to you, but these sellers will try to pass off fake copies of games as real. I've seen it a lot on Mercari, as I'm pretty good at spotting fake Game Boy Advance games. And I will give some of these sellers the benefit of the doubt, as some of them probably don't know the games are fake. You want to be careful around Pokemon games though, as there are so many fake ones. Now another thing that crackhead sellers like to do, and this one is super hilarious, is that they list Pokemon games with these big letters around the picture of the game saying new battery, or all Pokemon caught, or all shinies, or all in-game events. And they seriously think that just because they put a new battery in the game, that you're supposed to bend over backwards and pay them like $50 more than the game is worth. Like, dude, it should already have a working battery in it, come on. Also, these batteries are super cheap, and replacing them takes like 5 minutes if you know what you're doing. And who cares if you have all the shiny Pokemon? Like seriously, you just cheated them into the game. It's not like you spent the 1,000 hours required to collect every single one of those Pokemon. I mean, is anyone impressed by these guys? Is anyone just thinking, wow, you have a cartridge with all the shiny Pokemon? Yeah, let me give you $200 for Fire Red, even though it's only worth half of that. Anyway, I thought I'd just clue you guys in on the total absurdity of these people and hopefully give you a good laugh. All in all, guys, I would just recommend going on Facebook Marketplace to try and save the most money. Just steer clear of the crackhead sellers though. So what are my overall thoughts on retro game prices? Well, for starters, I think a lot of people telling you that you shouldn't get into retro gaming because of the high prices are definitely overreacting, as I've undoubtedly proven that there's many games that are still affordable, and even the games that are more expensive can still be found on marketplace apps for much cheaper. Yes, I understand that back in the day you were able to find a lot of games for lower prices, and I'm not denying that some of the prices today are absurd. But a lot of the games that have crazy prices now, like Earthbound, were also pretty expensive in the 2010s. Take 2012 for example. Even then, this game was going for around $180. We just have to understand that that time has passed, and maybe they will get cheaper, but as long as demand is high, I don't see it happening. Also, why do some of these people tend to only show complete in-box prices, which are very, very different from loose prices? I don't know why I always think back to this Linus Tech Tips video where he talks about how to legally emulate games. In the thumbnail, he shows that Super Mario World is $299. This large price tag is referring to the game complete in box, however, and is implying that it's too expensive and we should therefore emulate. But I always thought if you're gonna emulate, then that means you just want to play the game. And if you just want to play the game, then why would you buy it complete in box? When a loose copy of this game is only $19, not expensive at all. And nothing against Linus here, as if you actually watch the video, it's pretty informative and entertaining. And it's also not like he says don't buy retro games, they're too expensive, as the video isn't really even about that. I just thought the thumbnail was interesting and perfectly encapsulated how people often cite complete in-box copies and then complain that prices are too high. Now, a lot of other people who complain about high prices just so happen to be collectors. This is interesting because if you're just a person that wants to play retro games but not collect them, then why should you listen to a collector that's telling you prices are too high? I mean, realistically, how many games can the average person play through in a month or a year? I think your average retro gamer that plays through each game they buy isn't going to spend much more than a person who plays modern games. And in some cases, the person who plays modern games might spend more than the retro gamers. It just depends what games they play. In terms of collecting though, that's an expensive hobby, and you have to come to terms with that. Yes, I understand you might only be buying games every now and then to add to your collection, but you're still going to be spending more money than a person who just buys games to play them. I think if you take a lot of the collectors on YouTube as an example and ask them if they played every game they own, most of them are probably going to say no. And don't get me wrong, I think collecting is an amazing hobby. I love to watch tours of people's game rooms on YouTube, and I think one of the most awesome things that people do is collecting every single Pokemon game. But what I'm getting at here is that if you just want to buy games to play them, then this isn't really an expensive hobby at all. So my final question to answer here is, should you buy retro games? Yeah, of course you should. Without a doubt, prices are more expensive now than in the 2010s or 2000s. But that doesn't mean that buying these games has to be really expensive, as I've outlined many different avenues for obtaining these games cheaper. Here's one more tip before I go though. Don't go overboard with the amount of games you buy. You don't need to have every single game on a console. Just buy the games you want to play. By employing all of the methods I talk about in this video, you'll end up saving a lot of money. And realize that retro gaming doesn't have to be expensive. Thank you for watching.